I've always known my neighbor, a woman I'll call Bethany, was operating on a different plane of reality. But I never imagined her delusion would cost me hundreds of dollars and almost start a civil war in our quiet little community of Sycamore Heights. Until she decided my fence was a trespasser on her royal domain. The first time she cornered me, clipboard in hand, accusing me of property theft, I genuinely thought she was joking, a charmingly eccentric neighborhood moment. The second time, I realized she was dead serious. Her eyes narrowed like a general planning a siege. And the third time, well, that's when the chaos truly began. It was a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon. I was out back, grilling some steaks and enjoying the absolute peace of my little patch of suburban heaven, when I heard it, the sharp snap of a tape measure being deployed. I looked over the chain-link divider, and there she was, Bethany, standing on her side, wearing oversized gardening gloves, a visor, and a look of intense, almost pathological concentration. She didn't bother with a greeting. She just shouted, right over the sound of the sizzling charcoal, "Mr. Davies! Are you aware this structure is a full 2 feet onto the Cedar Creek Common area, which by the bylaws falls under my jurisdiction as architectural compliance chair?" I blinked, genuinely wondering if I'd woken up in a satirical news segment. "Bethany," I said, calmly flipping a steak, "this fence has been here since 1998, long before either of us moved in. It defines the property line." She scoffed, a truly magnificent sound of pure disdain. "That is what you believe," she declared, tapping a manicured nail on her clipboard. "I've reviewed the documents. I have the evidence." Now in Sycamore Heights parlance, when Bethany said she had the evidence, it meant she had once opened Google Earth, zoomed in to street level, maybe glanced at a blurry title transfer document from the 80s, and then appointed herself the official cartographer of the state. She spun on her heel, muttering darkly about legal injunctions and boundary violations, leaving me standing there, tongs in hand, shaking my head at the sheer theatricality of it all. But the next morning the comedy stopped. I stepped outside and found my entire backyard perimeter was decorated with little flags. Not cute. Patriotic flags, but bright, obnoxious fluorescent orange flags, stabbed into the ground like tiny, infuriating warning signs from a deranged explorer. That's when I realized she wasn't just bluffing for neighborhood drama. She had weaponized the HOA. Within a week, I received a certified letter, stamped with the HOA logo and smelling faintly of cheap perfume and desperate ambition, demanding I move the non-compliant structure within 10 business days. The HOA board, of course, was essentially run by Bethany's inner circle, particularly the HOA president, an equally high-strung woman named Patricia, who had the sickly sweet voice of someone who only ever delivers bad news. I called Patricia, immediately baffled. "What on earth are we talking about?" "It's a standard fence," Patricia replied in that breathy, apologetic tone that somehow makes your blood pressure spike faster than actual yelling. "We must uphold community standards, Mr. Davies. Bethany has provided irrefutable evidence of encroachment." That irrefutable evidence. It was a grainy, crooked cell phone photo, and yes, a blown-up screenshot from Google Earth with a poorly drawn red line indicating where she thought the boundary was. This whole thing wasn't just annoying, it was starting to get expensive. Moving an established fence, even a short section, meant permits, labor, and landscaping, a pointless expenditure I refused to accept just because my neighbor decided to play land baron. I looked at those ridiculous orange flags, then looked at the professionally drafted deed for my house, and decided to do the only logical thing. I hired an actual, licensed land surveyor. When I told Bethany that a professional was coming, she actually smirked. "Excellent idea, Mr. Davies," she purred, sounding like a villain in a bad spy film. "That way, when it confirms I am correct, you will have no one but yourself to blame for the removal costs." Her confidence was truly something to behold. It was almost endearing, in a deeply delusional way. The surveyor, a calm, middle-aged guy named Frank, showed up a few days later, loaded with his specialized equipment. And naturally, Bethany came charging out of her house like a torpedo, armed with her binder of research and that smug, triumphant smile that could power 1,000 HOA meetings. "Finally," she announced, practically vibrating with excitement, "someone who can settle this matter with the authority it deserves." Frank just nodded politely, set up his tripod and went to work while I stood back, trying desperately not to laugh at her sheer, unearned enthusiasm. For the next hour, Frank measured, checked the county pins, and double-checked his satellite data. Bethany hovered behind him like a drill sergeant at a military academy. At one point, she leaned in close to me, dropping her voice conspiratorially. "Just so you know, Mr. Davies," she whispered, "when he confirms it's on my land, I will be asking you to dismantle it immediately." No hard feelings, of course. I smiled back. "None at all, Bethany. Let's let the professional speak." Then came the moment of truth. Frank finished his work, packed up his gear, and turned to us both. He spoke in the calmest, most devastatingly factual voice I have ever heard. "Well," he said, looking at his notes, "according to the official county records and precise laser measurements, your fence, sir, is exactly 2 feet inside your property line, meaning it's actually further away from the boundary than legally necessary." Bethany blinked once, twice. "Wait, what?" Her voice was thin, reedy, utterly stripped of its previous authority. "That's impossible. I checked the—" Frank cut her off gently. "Ma'am, the fence has been correctly placed all along. In fact," he paused, glancing over his shoulder, "the real issue might be your shed." Bethany's jaw quite literally dropped. My shed?" Frank pointed toward her perfectly manicured backyard. "Yes, ma'am. It appears your shed is positioned approximately 18 inches onto Mr. Davies's property. It's a minor encroachment, but technically, that's the only structural violation on this property line." You could have heard a pin drop if the air itself hadn't been sucked out of the space by Bethany's sudden realization. She went snow-white, looking like a queen who had just realized her crown was made of tinfoil and her kingdom was built on borrowed soil. She mumbled something frantic about old measurements and misguided contractors before snapping her binder shut and practically running back into her house without another word. Frank packed up, chuckling softly. "You get this a lot?" I asked. He just smiled. "More than you'd think. Some people just can't handle the truth of a straight line." The next morning, all the bright orange flags were gone, snatched away, and for a short time, I enjoyed a smug, perfect peace. But I underestimated Bethany's capacity for delusion. For some people, being proven wrong doesn't teach a lesson. It just escalates the war. A few days later, an envelope arrived, taped to my front door. It wasn't just for me this time. It was a formal, multi-page notice from the HOA, signed by Patricia, announcing a massive, mandatory community-wide boundary audit. The letter demanded that every homeowner on our street must provide proof of their property boundary accuracy within 10 days, at their own expense. 10 days. It wasn't about the community. It was a targeted campaign against me, a desperate attempt to prove that if my fence wasn't wrong, the entire street must be. I walked over to the HOA office, which is really just a glorified, poorly ventilated shed behind the community clubhouse, and found Patricia sitting there, shuffling a stack of papers that looked suspiciously blank. "So, Patricia," I said, leaning on the doorway, "you're really auditing the entire neighborhood, forcing dozens of good people to shell out hundreds of dollars. Because Bethany, doesn't like my fence." She gave me that practiced, saccharine HOA smile. "This is about fairness, Mr. Davies. We must ensure everyone adheres to the same rules for the aesthetic and legal integrity of Sycamore Heights." I laughed, short and sharp. Rules or Bethany's feelings? Her smile twitched, just barely. "You would be surprised," she began, but I cut her off. "I'd be surprised if a single complaint in that stack wasn't signed by Bethany Miller. Just admit it." She didn't answer, and her silence was all the confirmation I needed. The funny part? My neighbors were furious. Not at me, but at the absurdity of the HOA, and, by extension, at Bethany. The Sycamore Heights Facebook group exploded. People started realizing that Bethany's little crusade wasn't just annoying. It was directly costing them time and money. One post read, "If Bethany wants to move fences, she can start by moving mine herself." Another, "This is exactly why nobody invites her to the summer block party." But she didn't stop. Oh no. Bethany showed up at my door again, clipboard in hand, wearing a neon yellow reflective vest like a seasoned construction foreman. "I'm giving you one last chance," she said, her voice low and dramatic, "to correct the record." She handed me a printed map, a disaster of hand-drawn lines that looked like it had been traced from memory by a sleepy toddler. North was pointing sideways, and she had drawn my fence in a shade of orange crayon. "This," she declared, "is the original undisputed plat map from the city archives." I pulled out my phone, opened the actual verifiable county assessor's map, and laid it right next to her crayon creation. "Bethany," I said, pointing to the official document, "explain to me why the map from the city archives has your name written on it in bubble letters and a very large drawing of a lilac bush." She snatched the paper back, muttering something vague about confidential, proprietary records, and retreated as if from a losing battle. But then things took a turn from hilarious to genuinely shocking. At the next HOA meeting, which I only attended because my neighbor bribed me with a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies, Bethany stood up, waving a manila folder like she had uncovered the Kennedy assassination files. "This community," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the cheap walls of the clubhouse, "has been living under false assumptions. Our entire block's boundary markers were misplaced during the original 1980 development. I have proof." Patricia nodded dramatically, clearly in on the latest scheme. But before anyone could seriously react, a neighbor, a retired city engineer named Howard, squinted at the folder and yelled, "Proof? Or more of your coloring projects, Bethany?" The room roared with laughter, but Bethany was unfazed. She slammed down a map, and to everyone's momentary disbelief, it actually had official-looking seals. For a split second, a cold wave of doubt washed over me. Did she actually find something? Howard, the retired engineer, stood up, walked over, and peered closely at the document. "Bethany," he drawled, his voice slow and heavy with authority, "these seals, they're from the Parks Department, not the Land Management Office." He pointed to the script. "And this font. It's Comic Sans." The room fell into dead silence, then erupted into pure, glorious, unified laughter. Bethany, red-faced and furious, grabbed her papers and bolted, shouting something about corruption and fake news. It should have ended there, but it didn't. 2 days later, I got a bizarre email from the county assessor's office. Apparently, Bethany had tried to file an official boundary correction for the entire street using her own name. The clerk called me personally, barely suppressing laughter. Sir, did you authorize a woman named Bethany Miller to modify your property record?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "Absolutely not," I said. The clerk sighed. "Yeah, we thought so." She submitted her survey sketch, in crayon. At this point, even the county employees were laughing at Sycamore Heights' local tyrant. That's when I realized the stakes had gone beyond comedy. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor. This was a full-blown delusional bureaucratic terrorist. I wasn't just going to prove her wrong anymore. I was going to expose the whole truth, how long she had been lying about her boundaries to harass people. And what I found next would blow up her entire HOA empire. I went straight to the county office, pulling up every single original plat and deed for our subdivision. And there it was, the smoking gun, Bethany's property line. It had indeed been corrected, but not recently, and not as part of some conspiracy. It had been corrected over a decade ago after a minor developer measurement error. And guess who had signed off on the corrected official county-stamped deed acknowledging the new true boundary lines? Bethany Miller herself. My jaw actually dropped. She had known the exact truth the entire time she had owned the property. And she had spent 10 years using that knowledge to falsely accuse and bully her neighbors into moving sheds, fences, and flower beds. She wasn't mistaken. She was a calculated liar. I made a few copies. Okay, more than a few. Enough to fill a binder thicker than the HOA rule book. I brought it all to the next HOA meeting. Normally, these meetings are less exciting than watching paint dry, but that night, every seat was packed. Half the neighborhood showed up with popcorn, having heard the rumors. Bethany strutted in late, wearing sunglasses indoors and clutching her clipboard like a sacred weapon. Before she could launch her next ridiculous campaign, I stood up. "Before we begin," I said, my voice steady, "I'd like to present some documents regarding property boundaries." Patricia tried to stop me. "That's not on the agenda, Mr. Davies." "Oh, I think it is now," I interrupted, opening the binder with a dramatic, satisfying thunk. These are county-verified plats showing that the property line for Lot 14, Bethany Miller's house, was corrected and officially approved by her signature. Dated June 14, 2013. The room went dead silent. Bethany froze, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. I continued, my voice ringing clearly. "So for the past 10 years, this woman has been accusing multiple neighbors of encroachment, forcing them to spend thousands on moving structures, all while knowing full well she signed the correction herself." Someone in the back yelled, "Wait, she did that to me." Another shouted, "And me." She made me move my shed by 6 feet. Suddenly, the whole room dissolved into a chaotic courtroom. People were waving their old HOA fines, shouting about Bethany's false complaints and her abuse of power. Patricia tried to restore order, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane with a hairdryer. Bethany's face turned bright Venus crimson. "Those documents are forged," she screamed. I slid the key document across the table toward her. "Funny," I said calmly, "because the county clerk confirmed this signature with me this morning." She snatched the paper, looked at the undeniable black ink of her own signature, and I swear I saw the exact fleeting moment she recognized her own handwriting. She stood up, pointed a shaking finger at me, and with one last, desperate gasp of ego, shouted, "You think this proves anything? I am the HOA." The crowd erupted in laughter, and a guy near the door yelled, "Not anymore, you're not!" The HOA board, probably just trying to save their own necks and property values, held an emergency vote right then and there. Within 5 minutes, with an almost unanimous shout, Bethany was officially removed from all her HOA positions. She stormed out like a villain at the end of a bad soap opera, muttering about starting her own superior association, and a collective sigh of relief washed over Sycamore Heights. But the most satisfying part, the true beautiful dose of karma, came 2 weeks later. A city inspector showed up at her house, having apparently received an anonymous tip about a certain shed that extended 18 inches over the property line. He measured it, nodded, and slapped a huge bright orange notice right on her front door. Structure must be relocated or removed. The irony was so rich I could practically taste it. Bethany tried to argue, of course, even claiming I had somehow moved the earth itself to shift the boundary line. But the inspector just smiled and said, "Ma'am, the planet doesn't rotate that fast." A few days later, I watched from my porch, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, as she hired a crew to physically drag her entire shed 2 feet to the left. Every metallic screech and every slam of the hammer sounded like the sweet, sweet rhythm of justice being served. The neighborhood threw a small, impromptu party that weekend. Someone brought cupcakes with little paper fences on them. Even the newly formed, competent HOA board showed up and personally apologized for all the nonsense. As for Bethany, she barely speaks to anyone now. Her clipboards are retired, and rumor has it she finally sold her house and joined a different HOA in a neighboring county. God help them. Sometimes I just sit out on my porch, look at my perfectly legal, unmoved fence, and smile. Because in the end, all it took to defeat a neighborhood tyrant wasn't yelling or lawsuits or even her precious clipboards. All it took was a cold, hard fact from a land surveyor, a few official county records, and a whole lot of community patience. Oh, and maybe just a little bit of delicious, perfectly measured karma. If you've ever had to deal with an HOA bully or a neighbor who thinks they own more than they do, hit that like button and tell me your wildest story in the comments below. Was justice served in your situation? Or did the tyranny continue? Let me know, and let's talk about how the real world deals with its own Sycamore Heights Bethanies. Don't forget to subscribe for more HOA tales where the drama is real and the facts always win. I'll see you in the next story.